Banks shuttered overnight. Fuel prices triple in days. Entire currencies vanish before your next paycheck hits. And the trigger, not war, not a virus, just one U.S. recession. The United States doesn't just dominate the global economy, it props it up. So what happens when that pillar cracks? Around the world there are nations already hanging by a thread. Some are drowning in debt. Others depend on U.S. trade, aid, or investment to survive. And if the U.S. stumbles, they won't just feel it, they'll collapse. Which countries are on the brink, and how close are they to the edge? Let's find out. Number 10. Lebanon. A country once known for its banking secrecy and Mediterranean charm, now gasping for economic oxygen. Lebanon is not just in trouble, it's already halfway over the cliff. Banks have frozen withdrawals, the currency has lost over 90% of its value, and still, many Lebanese families rely on one thing to survive: U.S. dollar remittances from relatives abroad. But here's the danger. If a U.S. recession hits, those lifelines, they dry up. No more cash inflows, no more bailout promises, just a paralyzed government, spiraling inflation, and millions stuck in an economy that no longer functions. You think things are bad now? A dip in global aid or trade could shut the lights off for good. Hospitals can't import supplies. Students can't afford tuition. Supermarkets run out of basics. If the United States sneezes, Lebanon doesn't catch a cold. It collapses. And in this fragile game, there's no restart button. Number 9. Pakistan. A nuclear power, a rising tech hub, a nation of over 240 million, and yet one economic shock away from total collapse. Pakistan is walking a financial tightrope with no safety net. Foreign reserves barely enough for 6 weeks of imports, external debt over 130 billion US, and repayments in 2025 alone exceed 22 billion. So what happens if the United States, its biggest trading partner and remittance source, falls into recession? Remittances plummet. Investment dries up, imports stall, and without those US dollar inflows, the Pakistani rupee doesn't just slide, it crashes. Fuel shortages, blackouts, skyrocketing food prices. We've already seen glimpses, but a US downturn could push it all into free fall. Want us to keep exposing fragile economies before they break? Hit that subscribe button so we can keep bringing you real research, global insights. Now, back to the countdown. Because Pakistan's crisis is just the beginning. Number 8. Argentina. A country rich in farmland, lithium and culture, yet trapped in a nightmare of debt, inflation and political gridlock. Here's the harsh truth. Argentina doesn't need a U.S. recession to suffer. It's already unraveling. But if the United States economy does slip, Argentina might not survive the fall. This is a nation that's defaulted 9 times. That's not a typo. 9. Right now it owes the International Monetary Fund over 45 billion US, more than any country in history, and those repayments are due now, not in some distant future. Inflation. It peaked above 200% in 2024. That means grocery prices doubling in months, pensions wiped out, savings worthless. Even with recent efforts bringing inflation closer to 56%, it's far from stable. So how does the US tie in? Argentina leans heavily on US and European markets for trade, financial access and credit ratings. If investors panic during a US downturn, Argentina's bond yields spike and refinancing becomes impossible. Just one ripple could trigger another full-blown default. Exports like soybeans and lithium, some of its few lifelines, would lose value. Currency reserves would evaporate, and millions could be pushed below the poverty line again. And then there's trust. Argentina's government has changed economic policies 5 times in 4 years. New taxes, lifted price controls, then reinstated again. One day fuel is subsidized, the next it's unaffordable. That kind of instability kills investment, especially when the global financial system starts pulling back. So is Argentina doomed? Not yet, but it's dangerously exposed. And if the United States enters recession, Argentina doesn't just face another rough patch. It faces the collapse of its economic foundation with no room left for error. What happens when a country runs out of credit, out of credibility, and out of time all at once? Argentina might be the first to show us. Number 7. Egypt. Luxury resorts sit empty. Shipping lanes once packed with tankers now echo with silence. Families once middle class scramble to afford bread. Egypt, home to over 110 million people, is standing on a financial fault line. And if the United States enters a recession, that line could split wide open. Here's why. Egypt depends heavily on 3 things: tourism, foreign investment, and fees from the Suez Canal. All 3 are tied to global trade and stability. both of which vanish fast when the U.S. economy slows down. In 2024, Egypt's external debt passed $165 billion. Servicing that debt in 2025 alone will cost more than $42 billion, and with inflation still hovering around 30%, the Egyptian pound has already lost much of its value. Now imagine what happens when foreign currency stops flowing in. Tourists cancel flights, investors pull out, global shipping slows, and with fuel and food largely imported, daily life becomes unsustainable. Shortages, rationing, and unrest are not predictions. They're historical patterns. We've seen it before. The government struck a deal with the International Monetary Fund worth $8 billion US, but that program demands strict reforms, lifting subsidies, devaluing currency further, and reducing public sector hiring, all of which hit the poor hardest and stir political tensions in a region that cannot afford more instability. Egypt is also closely watched by Western powers. The United States alone sends over $1 billion US annually in military and economic aid, but in a U.S. recession that aid could shrink or vanish altogether. So here's the brutal question. What happens when a megacity like Cairo with over 20 million residents starts running out of food, fuel, or jobs? This isn't about speculation, it's about timing. And for Egypt, that countdown may already be ticking. Want more real-world economic breakdowns backed by data and delivered straight? Subscribe now so we can keep bringing you the global truths others won't. Now let's see which country is next on this fragile list. Number 6, Ghana. Debt crisis, currency crash, food prices soaring, and that was before a global recession. Ghana is hailed as one of West Africa's most promising economies, but behind the headlines is a country dangerously close to collapse, and if the United States economy stumbles, Ghana might be among the first to fall. Let's break it down. In 2022, Ghana became the first African country to default on its debt since the pandemic. Its currency, the Ghanaian Cedi, lost more than 50% of its value in a single year. Inflation soared past 54%. That means basic items, rice, fuel, medicine doubled in cost while wages stayed flat. Now in 2025, things are still fragile. Ghana owes over $58 billion US in external debt, and though it secured a $3 billion US bailout from the International Monetary Fund, the relief came with strings attached: higher taxes, spending cuts, and reduced subsidies. But here's the real threat: remittances and trade. Ghana relies heavily on US dollars sent home from workers abroad. In 2024 alone, remittances brought in over $4 billion US. That is more than gold exports. If the United States enters recession and job losses hit immigrant communities first, that cash dries up instantly. Foreign investment already in retreat. And if US investors pull out further during a downturn, the Ghanaian economy loses one of its last lifelines. And then there's food. Over 30% of Ghana's wheat imports come from abroad, much of it indirectly tied to US-backed trade networks. Any disruption spikes prices again. So ask yourself, what happens when debt repayments rise, foreign dollars vanish, and people can't afford to eat? We're not talking about inconvenience. We're talking about national instability. The Ghanaian government is trying to stabilize things, but with such heavy dependence on outside cash flows, especially from the United States, one shock could undo it all. Is Ghana strong enough to weather another storm, or is it just one recession away from repeating history? Number 5, Zambia. Copper mines still hume, but the silence in government vaults says everything. Zambia is running on borrowed time. This is a country that once rode the highs of global demand, but today, its economy is tangled in a web of debt, default, and dependence. And if the United States enters recession, Zambia might not just falter, it could go dark. Start with the foundation. Zambia is the second largest copper producer in Africa. That metal brings in over 70% of its export revenue. But copper prices rise and fall with global demand. And when the U.S. economy slows down, demand plummets. Now consider the debt. Zambia became the first African country to default during the pandemic in 2020. Still trying to restructure more than $13 billion US in external debt. Private creditors, China, and multilateral lenders are all in the mix, and progress has been painfully slow. With rising interest rates in the West and a weakening kwacha, Zambia's repayments are becoming unsustainable. Food and fuel prices are already high. If the United States slips into recession and triggers another wave of capital flight, Zambia won't just miss payments. It could plunge into another full-blown economic crisis. And don't forget the human cost. Nearly half the population lives in poverty. Schools rely on donor funding. Hospitals depend on imported medicine. Any shock to foreign aid, trade, or remittance inflows creates instant shortages. Foreign direct investment already scarce.
and if U.S. investors pull back further, projects stall, jobs vanish, and development freezes. The Zambian government has tried reform. They've floated the currency, introduced austerity, sought help from the International Monetary Fund. But those changes take time, and Zambia doesn't have it. So what happens when the price of copper drops, the debt clock keeps ticking, and outside cash disappears? Zambia isn't just exposed, it's wide open. Want more of these hard truths, backed by data and told without filters? Hit subscribe so we can keep bringing you the stories most overlooked. Next up, a country whose economy is built on oil but could drown without it. Number 4, Sri Lanka. Gas stations with no fuel, supermarket shelves stripped bare, protesters storming the presidential palace. This isn't a movie, it already happened. Sri Lanka gave the world a glimpse of what true economic collapse looks like. And here's the terrifying part. The worst may not be over. In 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt for the first time in history. Its foreign currency reserves were nearly gone. Power cuts lasted for hours. Food inflation soared past 90%. And people, millions of them, lined up just for cooking gas. Now in 2025, the country is still trying to crawl out of that crater, but it's moving on a knife's edge. And if the United States enters recession, Sri Lanka could be pushed right back into freefall. Why? Because Sri Lanka's recovery depends on tourism, remittances, and foreign investment, all deeply tied to the strength of wealthier nations. And when the U.S. economy slows down, people stop traveling, overseas workers lose jobs, investors get cautious. Tourism alone brings in nearly $5 billion US annually, a lifeline that disappears the moment global fear rises. Add in the fact that many Sri Lankan workers abroad are in the Middle East and Europe, regions where employment is sensitive to U.S. market shifts, and suddenly the remittance stream dries up too. Then there's the debt trap. Even after restructuring, Sri Lanka still owes billions to foreign creditors, including China and the International Monetary Fund. And those payments do not pause just because the global economy hits a bump. Inflation remains stubborn. The Sri Lankan rupee is still volatile, and political tensions remain just beneath the surface. So what happens if global trade tightens and the US dollar strengthens while Sri Lanka is left holding the bill? The exact same crisis we saw before: fuel lines, blackouts, mass protests could return. Only this time, the country may not have the strength or the sympathy to climb out again. Sri Lanka isn't just vulnerable, it's already been wounded. And the next shock might not just knock it down, it might finish the job. Number 3. Ecuador. Bodies of water drying up, power cuts rolling through cities, military tanks rolling into the streets, not for war but to control gangs. This is not some distant nightmare, it is Ecuador right now, and it is unraveling. Once seen as a middle-income nation on the rise, Ecuador is now caught in a perfect storm: energy shortages, exploding violence, and an economy tethered to foreign demand. And if the United States falls into recession, Ecuador might not just stumble, it could spiral into chaos. Here's the first warning sign. Ecuador uses the United States dollar as its official currency. That means it cannot print money, adjust interest rates, or cushion economic shocks. When the United States sneezes, Ecuador catches pneumonia. And there's more. Ecuador relies heavily on oil exports. That black gold makes up over 30% of its export revenue. But oil prices drop the moment global demand slows, and nothing crushes demand like a U.S. recession. If crude prices tank, Ecuador's main income source vanishes. Now layer in violence. Drug cartels have turned once safe cities like Guayaquil into war zones. The government declared an internal armed conflict in 2024. Tourists stopped coming. Foreign investors pulled out and security costs skyrocketed. The result: rising unemployment, growing public debt, shrinking public services, hospitals without supplies, schools on the verge of closure, and an energy crisis triggered by droughts that have nearly dried out Ecuador's hydroelectric reserves with no local currency to devalue and limited borrowing options. The government is backed into a corner. A United States recession would cut into oil revenue, shrink remittances from abroad, and push inflation even higher as the dollar strengthens globally. And with presidential power shifting rapidly and public trust wearing thin, political instability could reach a boiling point. The stakes: national default, mass migration, another Latin American crisis on the doorstep. Ecuador is not just vulnerable, it is exposed on every front. The dollar it depends on could become the anchor that drowns it. Want more hard truths like this? Hit subscribe so we can keep uncovering what others won't. Next, a country whose economy looks strong on paper but is one policy shift away from total collapse. Number 2. Tunisia. A middle-class dream collapsing in real time. Breadlines growing longer, pharmacies running out of basic medicine, and tourists, once the lifeblood of the economy, vanishing as fast as government funds. Tunisia is not just struggling, it is suffocating under the weight of rising debt, political tension, and a vanishing safety net. And if the United States enters a recession, Tunisia might not have the strength to survive the shock. This is a country whose budget is already on life support. Nearly 40% of Tunisia's annual budget goes toward public wages and subsidies, money it borrows heavily to maintain. With inflation eating away at purchasing power and food prices spiking globally, the strain is unbearable. And here's where it gets dangerous. Tunisia depends on imported food and fuel. If global prices jump or if the United States downturn sends ripple effects through Europe, its top trade partner Tunisia faces potential supply chain nightmares and civil unrest. The political scene fragile. President Kaisia dissolved parliament, seized control, and faces growing backlash. Investors are watching and pulling away. Talks with the International Monetary Fund have stalled repeatedly. Without a rescue deal, Tunisia risks default. Now throw in youth unemployment hovering around 36% and a public losing faith in its leaders. One global disruption, one missed payment, one failed harvest, and Tunisia could be next in line for collapse. Number 1. Jordan. How long can a country survive when it imports over 90% of its energy, yet has no oil of its own? Jordan walks a financial tightrope every single day. The country relies on fragile alliances, foreign aid, and loans from institutions like the International Monetary Fund to keep its economy breathing. But here's the danger. If the United States enters a recession and global financial aid dries up even slightly, Jordan's balance could collapse in weeks. This is a nation wedged between regional conflicts, and yet it has remained surprisingly stable, but at a cost. Public debt now exceeds 100% of its gross domestic product. Youth unemployment is nearly 50%. Food prices have jumped sharply, and water, Jordan's most precious resource, is growing scarcer by the year. Now picture this. Remittances from Jordanians working abroad suddenly shrink. European Union tourist numbers drop. International funding slows. What happens? Even the slightest external shock, whether in the form of rising energy costs or reduced international support, could light a fuse beneath an already struggling population. And here's one more twist. Starting in 2026, the European Travel Information and Authorization System, known as EDIAS, will impact travel for Jordanians heading to Europe. That means more hurdles for tourism, for business, and for families hoping to stay connected with their diaspora. For Jordan, there is no margin for error. One down and could be all it takes to unravel years of fragile stability. The question now is, will the next shock come from the outside or from within? If this shocked you, there's more ahead. Hit subscribe, like the video, and share it so others can see what's really happening. We break down global collapses before they hit the headlines. Stay informed. See you in the next video.